On the other end of the spectrum, though, at the same time, we have the Byzantine Empire, right, with Constantine, and what starts to form in Constantinople thereafter is different. The role of Christianity is massive. It's an important part of the power structure, but it doesn't come from a pope like in Rome. It comes from the emperor himself. So on the Byzantine structure, you have the Byzantine emperors who are more autocratic. They have absolute power. And they have absolute power because they are also, in a way, seen as semi-divine. It's rather than an emperor like Charlemagne, who gets its power and crowning from the Pope, the Byzantine emperors, they are the church. They are seen as the deputy of earth for the will of God, and they are the head of the church. They are the head of the Byzantine Empire, whereas the Pope is the head of the church and has this sort of relationship with the kings of Western Europe. Byzantine Empire is the church and is the empire. So you have patriarchs, as the head of the church, who are appointed by the emperor, but the emperor is the one who appoints them, so who has the power? Again, it's the emperor in this case. The power of the empire, this is an important thing, and this is the legacy of Rome. They call them, it's called the Caesaropapism, all right? Caesaropapism, which is the word Caesar and father, right? So you got Caesar and father and the Pope all in one, Caesaropapism. So you have, going the lasting legacy of the Caesar, the head of the Roman Empire, and then also the head of the church. And that is the ruler's role, and that's the power of the emperor of Byzantine. That differs drastically. That is a huge comparison and difference to what is happening and arising in Western Europe. So on Byzantine on one side, Caesaropapism. Western Europe, you have empires and you have kings emerging, but that is a separate power to the power of the church, the power of the Pope, and creates two different power structures that emerge in these different regions. One particular emperor of this Byzantine Empire you read about is Justinian. Justinian and Theodora, amazing story of the two. We won't get into it too depth, but you feel free to read about it, look at it. A wonderful example of power between these two, this couple. Would be a great movie. Theodora was an amazing, prostitute in her day, and caught the eye of Justinian, and he made it. Long story short, made her his wife, and was an amazing queen. Really did a lot of good stuff, and is written about with a lot of passion. Especially with the crises that happens, which Justinian, unfortunately, is really known for, the crisis that emerges that we will talk about. Really briefly, Justinian and Theodora, their reign was just like this post-colonial or post-classical time period, an era of readjustment and restoration. So here they reconquest militarily. What they lost with the ancient Roman Empire, the classical Roman Empire. They lost North Africa, Spain, parts of Italy. Well, Justinian gets that back through military conquest. He restores Roman law. The laws of Justinian, this corpus of law that's still a 1,500-page Roman law book in Latin. Justinian's laws, who's in Greek, starts to merge together, and it's still seen as the European law foundation to this day, the laws of Justinian. But its foundation, Rome and his sort of Greek influence here, creates these laws, Roman laws of Justinian. So restoration of law. Also public building projects. If you think of the Roman Empire and the wonderful buildings that they do, to think of the Colosseum, for example, and everything else in Rome and wherever Roman Empire went to. Same thing with Justinian. And in fact, he states in 532, after a huge riot, there's huge riots that emerge in these empires, as always. And one way to get the people's love back and to really put effort and resources into public restoration is he works on the Hagia Sophia. Right, so this wonderful house of Justinian, wisdom. He really created a lot of rebirth of the Roman Empire. In his day, he would have called it Rome. The people of Byzantium would have called their empire Rome. We know it today as Byzantium. We know it today as the Byzantine Empire because that helps us realize and understand that it is something different than the classical Roman Empire. This is a new empire. This is the post-classical empire. And Justinian, in many ways, creates a golden age with the works that he does at Constantinople, with Hagia Sophia. And with the Hagia Sophia, we know it today as a mosque because it's in the city of Istanbul, but that's after 1453. Before 1453, it's the center of the Greek Orthodox Church. And Hagia Sophia is this amazing Christian church that gives glory to, well, it gives glory to God, but it gives glory to this Byzantine Empire. And Justinian could be seen as the center of that. Also with the laws that he creates. It's still a legacy in European law today. But unfortunately, outside events is what he's most remembered for. And with what is known as this right here, King Death. King Death came to rule Eurasia and will outlast any legacy, and in fact will conquer any empire. It does during the reign of Justinian, and it does centuries later, as we will see if you look at medieval history and medieval Europe. But it all, King Death starts and travels through this here. Yeah, this is the Silk Road. And if you remember, when we talked about world systems of exchange, what we've been looking at thus far is the spread of people, the spread of empires, the spread of goods along this road here that you could kind of see that there's silk and, luxury goods and spices coming out of India. We talked about black pepper and all these things. But another thing spreads as well. And this cute little fella here, this little rat here would bring King Death. Traveling it from the steppe regions of Eurasia, we have, on top of these rats, you have this flea. And inside these fleas, here's the actual size here. I don't know how big your screen is, but there you go. But you have fleas. And inside fleas, you have what's known as Yersinia pestis. And Yersinia pestis is what created, we know, as the Black Death, the plague. And we think of the plague from the 1500s, 1400s with Europe. But the first major world plague of this type that we know of, Yersinia pestis, happened, and it's unfortunately gone in history as Justinian's plague because it happened during Justinian's reign. And it spread the same way. And it spread through the lands of Eurasia. It's spread to China, spread through the Silk Road with rats on the carriages of traveling goods. And it made its way to Constantinople. So the rats carrying Yersinia pestis then transferred to the people, and it transferred to the people across Eurasia. You get outbursts of this plague in China and in India, throughout the regions, and also in Constantinople during Justinian's reign. So it is known, and the absolute horrific massive killings that this disease created, that Yersinia pestis created, is known as the Plague of Justinian, the Justinian plague. So there's three types, and this is the same in medieval Europe, that this Yersinia pestis would hit you. There's the bubonic. If you've ever said that you have a boo-boo, that comes from this word of bubonic. It's a flea-borne attack of the lymph nodes. So if you think of when you're sick and your lymph nodes are infected, well, that's what's happening here, but they get big and they burst with disease, with infection. And for those that have gotten Yersinia pestis during this plague of Justinian, 50 to 60% who had it through the bubonic stage got a boo-boo. They died, 50 to 60% of them. It can also spread through septicemically. Septicemic is the other way of the plague spreading, and this is the true Black Death. If you've seen Monty Python, or if you've heard of the Black Death, this in the age of Justinian happened, and it would turn gangrenous. And so it stank, it pussed, and 100% of the untreated people who had this version of the Black Death died. And this is the true Black Death. So this plague, because of the swelling, and it would turn black, and you get those infections of the bubonics, those boo-boos would turn black, the septicemia, and that was the other one. The one that spread the most, though, the one that caused the most death and was the worst, because once it got into your lungs, there was no way to get it out, and that's the pneumonic plague. So it's the same Yersinia pestis, but once it got airborne, and once it got into the lungs, it spread quicker, spread easier, spread farther, and it also killed 100%. So these three different versions of the plague is what hit during the age of Justinian in this Byzantine Empire. It didn't hit Western Europe. Why didn't it hit Western Europe as much? Well, if you think about it, remember, everything, all the resources went to Constantinople. And so Constantinople is part of trade, and it's interacting the most with East. Western Europe is becoming more isolated in this time period until about the year 1000. So the plague that's hitting the rest of this known world, it's not hitting lots of Africa, it's not hitting Western Europe, it's not hitting the Americas, that's for sure, because of the lack of world systems of exchange. These world systems of exchange is what's spreading the goods, people, idea, and disease. And if you're not part of that, it shows, in this case of Western Europe, that it's separate from that at this point. You see what I'm saying? So Justinian's plague, with all the great interaction that Justinian is able to do with the Byzantine Empire and the great stuff, the repercussion of that is the spread of disease that came in, and how the bubonic plague came and wiped out, devastating his empire. Plague, this is known as the Plague of Justinian, and Justinian would not be remembered for the Hagia Sophia, for all the other things, as much as he's known for being the emperor during the Plague of Justinian. So this Justinian plague, that's outbreak, initially in 541 and 542, really creating devastation in 1 year. The grain transportation from Egypt, the breadbasket of this empire, brought disease, carrying the rats. Other people traveling from the Silk Road brought disease, carrying rats. And every day, if you could imagine 10,000 people dying in the city of Constantinople, 10,000 every day in the city. Now, that spread to other parts of the empire and killing 100 million people across Eurasia. So from China across throughout the whole Silk Road, 100 million people died. And out of 26 million people that lived in Byzantium, 19 million survived. More than a quarter of the population dying from this disease. It was catastrophic. And if you can remember, they didn't know why. They thought it was many different reasons. Same with later, when you look at medieval Europe. They figure that God's mad at them, that there's something wrong with the empire, that God doesn't have faith in the emperor anymore. Same in China, same sort of things happening there. Remember with the mandate of heaven. When the plague hits China, it's seen that the mandate of heaven fell out of grace with the emperor there. So these catastrophes that happen spread. Now we know. They didn't know that it was spread by a rat with Yersinia pestis. They didn't have any of that. That is a modern day understanding of the plague. They had to make sense of it in their own ways, with their own worldviews. And that is something that is very interesting if you think about how they were thinking about how people, 100,000, 10,000 people dying in your city every day. And why is this occurring? The last outbreak of the Plague of Justinian in 747 stopped this completely. But it would come back in the 13th hundreds. It would come back in the 14th century with a vengeance. And there on out, there's still moments of the plague. So I want to finish with this image here, because this is an image that you today might associate with a different religion, a different culture. Oftentimes, if you saw a picture of this, you would assume that this is an Islamic person or Muslim. But you have to understand that the urban life of Byzantium and the Christianity that emerged in Byzantium had similar views of women. In fact, this outfit here was part of the Byzantium lifestyle. Women being in full headdress, in this burqa, what we might call a burqa today, was part of this world of Byzantium, was part of a Christian culture. Now, this same culture and its interaction with what's going to happen when I talk about next week's the Heirs of Rome, part 2 with Islam. What happens in the Arabian Peninsula and this interaction with the Byzantine Empire, those views start to trickle into early Islam. And so the burqa from Byzantium starts to play a major role in the early Islamic world, and we still see that today. But you must understand that that outfit and that way of life first came out of a Christian culture. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about and to end with as we look at Byzantium and we look at Justinian's plague, we look at Constantinople with Constantine, Western Europe still kind of doing its own thing with Charlemagne, Germanic tribes and the Vikings, not really going to unify themselves till after the year 1000, but Byzantium and the other heirs of Rome. And next week we will finish off with what's happening with the world of Islam.